So we'll go ahead and get started. So hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session. Today's session is all around creating an ARPA plan, and is just one of the many summer webinar series that are being offered through MMANC. So we're glad to see you here and also hope to see you on some of our other webinar sessions as well. Did want to take a quick moment just to acknowledge and thank our partners here on the screen for making this and so many of the other events and the work we do possible. A special shout out to management partners who in quick order was able to put together a session on creating an ARPA plan, given so many organizations being interested in figuring out how to make a good plan for their cities and communities. So we have a few presenters here that are going to share some great information with you. But before we get started, we did want to do a brief poll just to see who's in the room, how big your organizations are, just so we know who's joining us and how we can tailor this to you.
So since I'm the pollster, let me go ahead and start that poll, and it should be launched. Everybody, you should see the poll open. All of us are Zoom pros now, right? We all know how to do the Zoom thing. So if you wouldn't mind, go through and just answer the 4 quick questions that we have on here, and I will show the results as we do that.
Okay, and while folks are finishing the poll up, I'm just going to do some introductions of our presenters today. So we have the pollster himself, Steve Toler with Management Partners. So Steve is a partner with Management Partners. After serving 7 years in the public accounting profession, Steve enjoyed a 20-year career working in the cities of Cupertino, Millbrae, and Foster City in various capacities, ranging from IT director or IT manager and administrative services director to finance and budget director and assistant city manager. He joined Management Partners in 2015 and has served nearly 30 municipalities for a wide range of projects across California and the Pacific Northwest as a project manager, director, and subject matter expert. Steve leads the firm's efforts in helping cities assess the fiscal impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic, and is a leader in the firm's fiscal sustainability initiatives and planning in the use of ARPA funds. So we're glad Steve was available and able to help put this session together for us today.
Right. Thanks, Felicia.
Of course. And then we have Mr. Casey Estorga. So Casey is a 5th generation Bay Area resident with a 13-year career in public service. He's currently serving as the City of Scotts Valley's Administrative Services Director. Prior to his work with Scotts Valley, Casey held positions with several Bay Area government agencies, including the City of San Jose, City of Palo Alto, and the town of Los Gatos, as well as the County of San Benito and the County of San Mateo. He's also a former planning commissioner of the City of Gilroy. Additionally, he's worked in the private and nonprofit sectors on numerous public projects, and in his free time, he teaches courses on politics and government at a local community college. So not busy at all, right, Casey? Lots of stuff going on. Thanks for joining us. And then finally, we have Lauren Sugayan. Hopefully I said that right. Lauren is currently the assistant to the city manager for the City of Union City, a small, diverse city of 75,000 residents in the San Francisco Bay Area. In her position, she oversees strategic planning, public relations, and special projects and programs. Prior to Union City, Lauren notably helped to lead the Bay Area Rapid Transit Police Department through a crisis response in the aftermath of the high-profile police shooting death of Oscar Grant in 2009. She then went on to lead the Hayward Police Department through a successful reaccreditation with the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, which included the implementation and maintenance of over 400 best practices in law enforcement. Lauren is also a consultant with the California Office of Emergency Services, where she trains local government officials on media and crisis communication. She's also a great presenter and brings a lot of great knowledge and information from all her experience. So we're happy to have you 3 joining us. So Steve, I'm going to hand it over to you to report out on the poll and go over the agenda for the day.
Great. We, I think almost everybody, except for a couple people maybe, took the poll. So let me end polling and we'll share the results here. Good number of you are from represent cities and towns. We have a couple of 3 people from the county, from counties, 1 representing a special district, and a few of our private industry partners like myself. So looks like we've got a pretty good distribution in terms of the number of population that you all serve. So that's pretty good. And then the question was, has your agency received your ARPA funds? 9 of you said yes. No, you registered it, but any day now. And then some of you are not sure yet. So I bet all your finance directors know whether you got it. And then finally is, how many webinars or presentations you've attended. The 4 people that are the junkies, why are you not in this room doing this presentation with us? Kidding. So anyways, looks like several of you, though, this is your first time. So we'll try to do what we can to give you kind of a lay of the land of what ARPA is about, but really where our focus today is really on the creation of an ARPA plan for your organization. So let me go back to the slide deck and we will jump into what we're going to be covering today. So we'll be doing an overview of what ARPA is, but a lot of legislation, about 200-300 pages of text. We're going to cover it in 2 minutes. Watch me. And then we're going to talk about what are the opportunities to potentially use the ARPA funds strategically. And then we're going to hear from Casey and from Lauren about what their cities have, how they have viewed ARPA and how they're planning on using those funds. And then we'll talk then about how best to develop your agency's plan. So with that, briefly, management partners, we're thankful to be able to have this opportunity to be able to work alongside MMANC and the rest of you in serving you. We work exclusively with local governments and the work that we do. And so I think many of you on this call likely know about us or have heard about us. Let's dive into this. ARPA at warp speeds, right? So hold on to your seats because we're going to go through this quickly. As you might know, ARPA represented about a $1.9 trillion federal stimulus package that was approved and signed into law by President Biden on March 11th. Of that package, about $130 billion was dedicated to local governments, of which $65 billion the counties get. And then the other $65 billion is distributed to cities, whether you're a metropolitan city, which means a city over 50,000 population. You will get a direct distribution from the U.S. Treasury Department. Under 50,000 population are considered what's called non-entitlement units, NEUs, and you'll receive your funds via pass-through from the state. In this case, the California Department of Finance. The allocation was made formulaically based on population and will be paid in 2 installments or tranches, as they call it. The first tranche was received about June 21st, is when I heard the first agency received their first tranche. And then the second will be received a year later. As you see on the right, there are 5 uses. The legislation calls really for 4 uses, but the Treasury Department has expanded it to really cover 5 uses of the funds that are allowed. The first is in this area of supporting the public health expenditures related to the COVID-19 pandemic in dealing with anything from mitigation efforts to medical expenses, behavioral health care, public health and safety staff, so some areas there. The second area is related to how to respond to the economic impacts, and this addresses the negative economic impacts that might have been caused by the public health emergency, including impacts to workers, to households, to small businesses, impacted industries, and the public sector. We'll talk about some of the uses there. The third is to replace public sector lost revenues, and this funding is really fairly wide open in terms of being able to provide government services to the extent that it reflects the reduction in revenue that was experienced due to the pandemic. And there's a pretty gnarly, complex calculation methodology that's used in determining that. The fourth area is to provide premium pay for essential workers, offering additional support to those that have or will bear the greatest health risks because of their service in critical infrastructure sectors, which several agencies are indicating public sector is part of that. And then finally is investing in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure to make investments in everything from clean drinking water to support wastewater or stormwater infrastructure. So it's not just wastewater, it's also stormwater, and also to expand access to broadband internet service for in the community. So ARPA is a welcome rescue for local government, but as you well know, as public administrators, it's a challenge to balance the immediate stakeholder desires with investments that will help you in the long term. And there's going to be, and there is, a great deal of pressure to fund new programs and initiatives, either through local government or even through local nonprofit organizations that may be referenced in the legislation. And so as a first step, from our perspective, as those that serve local government from the outside, is that we really suggest that local governments adopt principles to ensure that ARPA funding makes your government fiscally sustainable in the future, even as you deploy these one-time resources to help your community. So with that kind of as a backdrop, let's talk briefly about what are some opportunities or suggestions for using these funds strategically. And there's 8 areas that I just want to address real quickly. Is that first is really to understand what the restrictions are on the use of the funds, but also appreciate the opportunities for potentially creative one-time uses. The legislation explicitly says that you cannot use funds directly or indirectly to offset tax reductions or to make deposits into pension funds, pension trusts. A lot of agencies have wanted to use it to maybe pay down their pension obligations. You cannot use ARPA funds to do that. You also, as was identified in the Treasury regulations, you can't use the funds to restore reserves to your general fund. You can use them to backfill costs, however, to the extent of revenue losses, and that does provide an opportunity. The second area is really one-time resources should be devoted to one-time costs. And as you respond to the human needs within your community, such as homelessness or hunger, eviction, foreclosure assistance, utility assistance, small business assistance, all these different types of aspects, we think it's really important to look at one-time strategic short-term initiatives rather than creating new programs. Otherwise, you're using these one-time funds and you're going to have to fund these programs in the long term. The third area really relates to this concept of capital improvements, and get your capital improvement plan in order. ARPA includes $10 billion outside of the $130 billion provided to local government. There's an additional $10 billion in additional grants for capital investments. There's uses within the local relief funds to use them to fund maintenance or infrastructure, as well as to fund the water, wastewater, and broadband infrastructure I indicated. So having a good, robust capital plan is going to be important for you to look at these monies as an opportunity to be able to invest strategically in those areas. This fourth area really is that the funds can be used to respond to the public health emergency that was associated with COVID-19 and the negative impacts to households or small businesses. But you really should do it to identify creative one-time uses. Are there ways that you can invest in the small businesses within your community, or to leverage partnerships with nonprofit organizations to help provide services, restoration services in restoring from the pandemic, as well as industries that might include tourism, travel, or hospitality. And for some of you that are tourism destinations, that might be something very important. The fifth area is in this area of virtualized services, and we've all been doing this stuff for the last year and a half, right? You have moved some of your workforce to remote capacity. Are there opportunities to be able to use these funds to look at taking the stock of the services that you virtualized during the pandemic and maybe making them, permanently converting them? That could end up reducing the amount of space you need in facilities, especially for some of you that might be renting facilities to provide your services. If there's a way to be able to constrict down the amount of footprint that you have in terms of building space and energy costs and transportation costs and all those different types of things, might be helpful to make sure that you're still able to provide services to your community seamlessly. The other areas in this area of backfilling allowable cost to the extent of revenue losses. As I mentioned before, you cannot merely transfer funds to your general fund to deal with the revenue losses. However, you can indicate that you're using those funds to the extent of revenue losses to pay for government services, especially public safety costs, which you might be, spending funds on anyways. So in some regards, it does help with backfilling that, but you're not just doing a one-shot transfer because that was disallowed by the Treasury regulations. But you should also take, such uses into consideration in your long-range financial forecast. You all have a long-range financial forecast, right? And determine the impact of those decisions on the fiscal sustainability of your organization and maintaining appropriate reserves in the future. So it could be helpful in terms of that and getting you back to restoring services. Finally, these last two are just really in the areas of trying to reduce future operating costs. One might be in the area of deferred maintenance. The other might be in the area of enhancing your existing infrastructure. Are there ways that you can make fiscal and environmental sustainability types of decisions to address these two needs? Maybe it's renewable energy, maybe it's replacing inefficient HVAC and lighting systems, replacing water sensitive landscaping with drought tolerant or low maintenance landscaping, or hardscapes to increase productivity, to reduce operating costs, and ultimately improve the quality of life. You don't have to spend all these funds today, though. You have until December of 2024, and in some limited circumstances, you might have another couple of years thereafter to be able to spend these monies. But we really would encourage organizations to take the long view of this, and how can you put these funds to use and make sure that you're expending them by December of 2024 under the concepts of what they provide. Briefly, I just want to then, let me see here. Sorry, I was trying to get that. So I do want to just take a quick note, and these slides will be made available to you. After the presentation, they'll be uploaded on the MMANC website. But I wanted to just mention real briefly here is that, there's $1.9 trillion in this stimulus package. There's opportunities for you to be able to leverage those funds. And so are there ways for you to take the, in some cases 2 million, in some cases $440 million of funds that you're going to be receiving, and leverage those with the other opportunities there are within the stimulus package to be able to address, small business and direct financial assistance, or education and healthcare in your community, or transportation needs that you might have, or being able to use some of the other funds that are available to emergency management and public safety programs. And so this is a great opportunity for you to be able to kind of like, in fundraising, hey, there's a match here, and for every dollar, there's another match. There might be an opportunity for you to invest some of your funds and leverage other monies that are available within ARPA. So before we get into creating an ARPA plan, let's talk about what two specific agencies have done in developing their plans. They're going to come to this from different perspectives. And first off is Casey Estorga. Casey is the Administrative Services Director, as you heard, with the City of Scotts Valley. Casey, why don't you go ahead and share a little bit about what Scotts Valley is doing in this area?
Absolutely. So thank you very much, Steve, for that intro. We can jump into that first slide here. So who is Scotts Valley? We are what I would argue is a relatively new city. We were first incorporated in 1966. We share a border with the city of Santa Cruz, which by reference was incorporated 100 years before Scotts Valley. We're just over Highway 17, 15 miles to Los Gatos, which can either take 15 minutes or 3 hours to get there, depending on the traffic and the weather. And we're also a short drive to San Jose, 20 miles to San Jose. And as you see the footnote there, 82% of cities based on their incorporation date are older than the city of Scotts Valley. So when you think about us and our needs as a city, only being 55 years old, keep that in mind with some of our infrastructure also being 55 years old. Our population is roughly 12,000 residents, and we've had relatively the same population for the past 20 or so years. It'll incrementally jump up by maybe a few dozen residents every year, but we're for the most part pretty consistent. Our average home price in the city of Scotts Valley is right around $1.3 million, and we've seen that incrementally jump up, especially over the last year and a half. I know there's some similar communities throughout the state that have had a similar experience. But with that goes hand in hand with our 55% of the population having a college degree of some sorts. And so when we reflect on where our community need might be, and we look at the eligible categories in ARPA, we look at that household necessity and how they were impacted by the pandemic. And that's where we have conversations about what someone's true need might be. Because frankly, some households have not had that direct impact. And we know that the pandemic in general has had a disparate impact on some communities and some neighborhoods specifically. So when we looked at our community, we took that into account as we decided what the plan might be. The final bullet point there is not a often known fact, but Netflix was started in the city of Scotts Valley. They started by renting a room at one of our local hotels. They paid weekly to rent a conference room. And part of the reason why they chose that was they had complimentary breakfasts. And as we all know, Los Gatos now is the home of Netflix, and they moved over the hill in 1999. And part of the reason was because while Scotts Valley had plenty of office infrastructure, they didn't have access to the talent that was up on in the Bay Area and on the peninsula. So that's kind of the flavor of who Scotts Valley is, a little bit of our history. We are a new city, but with that, 55 years of infrastructure results in some needs. And with the next slide, we'll talk more about our existing staff and our council and how we respond to it, something like ARPA coming in, and balance that with our ongoing demands as city staff and as a city and recovering through the pandemic, both financially and then working with the broader community to understand their needs and potentially offer some solutions. So how do we do that? Staff are tasked with this brand new ARPA tool. It came swiftly. We got the announcement. We knew the package was signed. We had some questions that had yet to be answered. But our small team here, where you see we have 62 FTEs currently in the budget, half of those are police officers. Of those 62 FTEs, only 46 positions are filled. And compare that back to 2003 numbers where we had 76 FTEs on the books. I think this is what many other agencies are experiencing, where we are a small staff, and on top of our day-to-day workload, here comes ARPA. What do we do? So that's the challenge that we very much experience. And also a very real variable as part of this conversation is our city council. I know our elected officials are unique in their own respects, and sometimes cities have either strong mayor, council manager, different types of relationships. But our council is very active in our organization. So we have some unique variables to come to play. We do have a 5-person city council with a rotating mayor. However, we don't have term limits for council members. And so that has resulted in 2 of our current council members being in their 4th and 6th consecutive terms, respectively. We also just recently, in the past few years, had a council member that had served 5 consecutive terms. So I'll talk more about that and why it matters in the following couple of slides. But also our current council members also include the former City of Scotts Valley Finance Director, the current Chief of Staff for the Mayor of San Jose, and then the godmother to our current police chief. And so that same individual is also a former police sergeant with our Scotts Valley Police Department. And so when we look to have the conversation about our needs, we see individuals that have investments, whether it's time on council. They've been around for whether that's 16 to 20 years on the city council, making decisions about prioritizing infrastructure investments or how to balance a budget or just how do we offer services. So when we have the conversations, we know a lot of people have history. And then when we get onto the topic of our former finance director is now a council member, the type of questions that we have to be prepared to answer are not just in the weeds, they're in the roots. We're talking to an audience that knows the language. So when staff comes to the council with a recommendation, we have to be spot on and answer questions at that 30,000 foot level, and also have a council member that knows the minutia. And so being able to respond to that. And one of the most interesting variables is that council member who's the chief of staff to the mayor of San Jose. So when I talk about, and we can jump to the next slide here, talk about keeping our ear to the ground, it's something where we get feedback and input about, hey, this neighboring city, quite frankly, the city of San Jose might be having this approach here. How can that apply to the city of Scotts Valley? So as staff, we're certainly balancing the conversations and understanding what a best practice might be from attending events like this, meetings like this, and then applying them to our specific occurrences. So through the life cycle, we first learned that, hey, the city of Scotts Valley is going to be eligible for ARPA funds. That chatter started filling the hallways here at City Hall, started popping up during meetings. However, we didn't immediately know exactly how much, and we still don't know when. We haven't received our first tranche. However, in the background, our draft budget was already prepared. And so we were running full speed ahead to adopt the budget on time, and we had this, we're getting two $1.4 million tranches of funding, so $2.8 million in total. What are we going to do with this $1.4 million of new funding that's coming in, and how do we strategize and prioritize it? With that comes that second bullet point, which kind of reflected on what Steve was covering in the intro, was what is ARPA and how can it be used? Sometimes we had to balance expectations of it's not just money that doesn't have any restrictions to it, because we saw some very clear disallowed activities. And so we had to balance expectations and introduce the idea at our council meetings. And so I think during the budget process, we had a couple of conversations with our council members where before we ever got to a staff recommendation, we introduced ARPA and gave some explanations about what it could and could not be used for. We didn't make any recommendations. We didn't really answer too many questions other than reference regulatory rules and kind of focus the attention there because one, we didn't have a strong recommendation just yet, but also we wanted to learn. We're kind of jumping down to that last bullet point. We very much watched, listened, and learned not only what was happening at the federal level in the conversations, especially with the interim final rule, the comment period, et cetera, but also what's going on throughout our region. Certainly, as I mentioned, the city of San Jose, which is, sometimes a 20-minute drive away from us, but also what's happening with similar communities our size and within our region. So we have like a Watsonville or a Hollister or even a Capitola as our close neighbors. And so myself as a staff person, I would casually look at their council agendas or follow their activity on social media to see, hey, they're posting things about a community event, a community meeting. Is that something that we should do? Does their city have the same type of needs as the Scotts Valley? So it's just really being attentive to the conversation at a regional level, which will help me introduce recommendations when we have, smaller staff meetings or certainly when we go to council. That third bullet point there is just a very real variable that came into play. We have 4 labor groups and all of them are actively in negotiations. Actually, 3 are actively in negotiations. 1 has been signed. But ARPA was introduced while we were all actively in negotiations. So we got some questions and comments from our labor groups and from our staff. And certainly from the finance side, we were curious as to what could we do with this one-time money and how could it potentially go to support our staff who, quite frankly, were working pretty darn normal operations during the pandemic. So we can jump to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we were looking at our region and cities that were both not like us in terms of population size and funding source, et cetera, but also some that were like us. And so we looked back at who we were. So this is kind of our Scotts Valley perspective, being that our community and city council absolutely adores our police department. And I know that's fairly uncommon, and it's a blessing that we have here in the city of Scotts Valley. And partially, we don't have the same types of public safety concerns that some of our neighbors have. Our crime levels are pretty unique and incredibly low. We don't have the same challenges with homelessness or the unhoused. And so when we look to evaluate how do we make a recommendation to city council and why we might be doing something different than a Capitola, which is 10 miles down the road, or a city of Santa Cruz, which is right next door, it's because we have fundamentally different needs in the community. Also, as we work through the budget process, we offered the city council a balanced budget that did include $2.5 million of deficit spending. So that was a very real variable in the conversation of our budget in the upcoming fiscal year. Actually, it's July in the current fiscal year, is that we are recovering, and it's a budget of returning to service levels that we had a year and a half ago. It is not a recovered budget, and so we had to include that as part of our conversation. And what could ARPA do for us? How could we supplement the next 2 to 3 year picture with some one-time monies from ARPA? And we certainly evaluated the personnel impacts. Like I mentioned before, the majority of our staff continued with normal-ish operations, and part of that is because 70% of our employees are either police or public works staff. We also kept our ear to the ground about what our neighbor agencies were doing in terms of their personnel impacts. And quite frankly, some of our neighboring industries had to do something like a furlough or a 10% pay cut for all of their staff. Fortunately, Scotts Valley didn't have to do that, but that certainly had an impact on our operation. What we did have to do was make a tough decision about our recreation division, something that is revenue dependent and where we saw the elimination, frankly, almost overnight of some of our recreation services. we were no longer collecting those revenues and could no longer support that program. Unfortunately, that resulted in staff layoffs and positions being frozen. So then we considered, how can ARPA potentially go to address those types of needs? And that's, again, a question that we haven't yet answered. And again, to our final point on this slide is that the city does have aging infrastructure. We have a 5-year, $24 million CIP with $5.5 million or 23% of that being unfunded. So when we put all these different variables in play, understanding our Scotts Valley picture, our resilience, our next year to 3 of recovery, what does that look like with this injection of, for us, $1.4 million over 2 years? And how do we manage that in terms of our decision-making process, staff's recommendation, and then managing the community expectations? Because certainly as city governments heard about this information, the community also caught wind of it too. And so we can jump to the next slide, because during our meetings, we would have conversations with the public and they would say, wait a minute, I see the city is getting new money. What about my neighborhood? And so I think this is Scotts Valley. I know we're unique. I know we're a small community, but this can very much be like a neighborhood for some of the larger counties or larger cities. So we're looking to introduce, hey, a community need, also with our small business need and our operational need as an agency, and kind of figuring out where the priorities are, because the needs, I think, are across the board. So when we evaluated our calculation, and with the help of Steve and management partners, we looked at, we did qualify under the general revenue loss category. We were worried for a moment, and I know there are cities throughout the state of California that have similar concerns where when they did the calculation, they became ineligible in the general revenue loss category. Part of what we had was at the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020, our residents voted to approve a 1.25% sales tax increase. We started collecting those revenues in July 2020. And as you see, this is going to give our community an opportunity to survive, quite frankly, without deeper cuts. It's going to be an influx of $3.4 million in fiscal year 21-22. Without that money, I don't know what our city would have looked like. The cuts would have been deeper and the recovery would have been much longer. So we had that, but also we had to calculate that when we were looking at our general revenue loss. Also, we had the benefit of referencing a city council policy. Well, when we were having the conversation with the city council, we reminded them these are one-time monies, and based on the policy that you set for yourself, they should only be used for one-time needs. So that was, I was thankful as a staff member where I didn't have to introduce a new idea. I was simply referencing the council policy, historical policies. So saying, hey, my recommendation number 1 is to align with your existing policy. To the next bullet point, it was just managing their expectations, the council, the staff, the labor groups, and the community members, and then being equitable in our recommendations, making sure that we didn't put them all into the police department if the need was throughout the organization, or we didn't put them all into one neighborhood if the need was citywide. So certainly we looked for that equity, and you'll see when we get to a couple more slides that our pace has been slow but deliberate. And I think that coincides with our third bullet point of acting swiftly but not immediately. It's this idea of here's new money, what do we do with it? And sometimes the answer is, I don't know, or let's pause so we can really strategize and really invest this wisely. We'll go to the next slide, please. So as a result, we reflected at our 5-year CIP and noticed that there was a list of, this isn't the right word, but kind of shovel-ready projects where we knew this was already on our menu. We knew this was an immediate need. And so we have this project, which is towards the top of the photo where it says Scotts Valley Recycling Info, kind of in that region. We had a project where we have a public works building that is close to this 55 years old, and it is always in need of repairs, and the repairs are sizable and consistent. So much so that it is a safety concern. And so we already had this in our CIP. We knew it was going to be roughly an $800,000 project. And so our staff's recommendation to the council was perfect. ARPA allows us to invest in infrastructure. This is what I'll call a shovel-ready type project. So let's, instead of having this 1 or 2 years down the road in our CIP, let's move it up to fiscal year 21-22. We're ready to take action. We need this not only for the safety and security of our staff, but for the public that visit that space, but also, quite frankly, and I know this is all real, especially myself as a staff member, being in a work environment that, has leaks or there's tears in the building or it's just unsafe, that has a direct impact on employee morale on top of the safety stuff, which is certainly precedent. So it's something where we saw an immediate need, and luckily we were ready. It was already on our radar to do. So our recommendation to council was, hey, let's move this project up. So council took our recommendation and introduced this $800,000 project for our public works facility into the current fiscal year 21-22, rather than putting it off for a couple of years. And with that, you see we had $1.4 million in the first year. That leaves $600,000 of ARPA funds unencumbered. So quite frankly, this is where we are acting with diligence and strategy. We have a couple of conversations going on where we haven't committed to anything. So we have a council subcommittee specifically looking at our small business community and what are their needs, and are they, immediate in nature? Because quite frankly, as a small business owner, you might see, okay, I need to have different signage now because the state rules or the county rules have changed. And if I need to spend an extra $1,000 or $2,000 on signage or, different regulations that I have to post, that's a real cost. And having, the challenges the last year and a half of being able to survive as a business, $1,000 or $2,000 cost added on top of that could quite frankly make or break some businesses. So we have our council subcommittee looking at those types of conversations. And I think two of the members on the subcommittee are business owners within our community. So they really know, their ear to the ground, understanding our business members' needs. So our recommendation to staff was encumber the $800,000 now for the public works project, and then let's have a follow-up conversation in the near future. So we can jump to the next slide. And that's where you see our astounding questions. So we have $600,000. What do we do with it? And then we have $1.4 million coming up in the next year. What do we do there? What are our immediate needs now? What is known based on our experiences as an agency, as a community? What is our short-term financial outlook? How can this one-time money over the next 2 to 3 years impact that? And then that's going to tell us how to make decisions. And then on the finance side, we did some processes to introduce controls. And we created a new fund. We know that we're going to have to track, monitor, and report out on our use of ARPA funds. And then also, as a small organization that doesn't traditionally get a lot of federal money, we reflected on, is this going to impact our necessity to complete a single audit? So I think maybe at the county level, you automatically be involved there, but that's certainly an element to measure of. That's an increased workload for city staff. So we put all these questions into a hat. We don't have a lot of answers, but we're working not only with our council subcommittee, but our city manager. And it's really an ongoing fluid conversation to identify eligible uses in ARPA, what our immediate needs are, and then what our needs might be over the next year and a half, not only in terms of service delivery, but our financial outlook. So we put that all into a pot and are continuing to reflect on that. So like with maybe a lot of communities, we have more questions than answers right now, but we know it's an ongoing process. So that's Scotts Valley in general. And I think with that, I'll hand it over to Lauren to hear more about how another city, Union City, is handling ARPA. Lauren?
Great. Thank you, Casey. And I just want to reflect, Casey and Steve are using, language throughout their presentation that really opens up into our case study pretty well. Steve talked a lot about strategic uses, and as a result, he really asked me to come on today to speak about Union City and our strategic plan, and really how we have worked to create a culture that is makes decisions around our strategic plan. And so that really helped us to get through this ARPA process successfully. And then Casey too, I like how, you sort of opened the stage, and I think every city, once we received the news and we were following the legislation, and we had to really wipe our eyes to believe it because it is a lot of money. But right away, we started dealing with, managing competing demands and priorities from all sorts of different groups. So I think, what's been helpful for the city of Union City with our strategic plan is we can lean on that to help manage our competing priorities. So before we turn the slide, let me give you a little bit of background, a little bit of a story about Union City so you can kind of understand how we were well prepared going into, the news about ARPA and the upcoming receipt of funds and making decisions around that. Union City is a small, diverse city. We are just south of Fremont in the East Bay area. We have a diverse population. In fact, we have Alameda County as a whole is I think the fourth most diverse county in the nation, and Union City is more diverse than Alameda County. So it just kind of goes to show, the various needs that our community might have. And in fact, 1/3 of our population is foreign born and bilingual. But something we're very proud of is that our 5-person city council, similar to Casey, we have a 5-person city council, is truly reflective of the community. In fact, each council member and the mayor largely reflects almost the exact demographics of our community. And Steve will talk in a little bit about the importance of community engagement and really having your community's voice reflected in this process. And surely we work to engage comprehensively with the community to make sure their voice is heard, but by way of having our city council involved in the process is also a great way for us to know that our community's diverse needs are being reflected. Regarding the city's finances going into the pandemic, we are a revenue and resource strapped city. So prior to the pandemic, we were already facing a long-term deficit a long-term structural deficit to the general fund. We are landlocked between a few different cities, and so we don't have much new development opportunity. We have significant warehousing in Union City. However, as of recent, there's been less turnover and vacancy rates are low. So conversion is a tough strategy to rely on. We also have a large commercial center that's at the center of town. It not only is an epicenter for our community, generates a lot of sales tax, but it's really where we get a lot of visitors from out of town who come to visit Union City and enjoy a movie or shop at some of our local stores. But some of the trouble we've been seeing there is that big box stores have been suffering a lot due to online sales, and that was happening long before the pandemic. So going into the pandemic, we really had revenue problems, and for that reason, Union City relies heavily on voter approved revenues. And in fact, about 15% of our general fund comes from voter approved revenues. We have a utility users tax that was just approved in November 2020. And we also have a 0.5-cent sales tax that's almost 10 years old and almost up for expiration. But those two together account for obviously a significant portion of our general fund. So it's no surprise really a few years leading into the pandemic that as city expenses started to go up pretty quickly, like other cities, that we found ourselves in significant fiscal trouble. So really our first step was to put together a strategic plan. Casey mentioned competing priorities, and those are things that we all have to deal with. And really Union City was not in a position to go day by day any longer, or to just have council members come and champion their own priorities and really drive up more costs potentially for the city. So we really needed to focus the city and the city council primarily around fiscal stability and sustainability, and then also ways to improve our city services. In 2019, we put together our first 5-year strategic plan. And the success there was that we brick by brick, from the city council to city staff to the community, started to build credibility and credibility in the plan. The city manager and I actually went on a road show across a whole year to educate various community stakeholders about our strategic plan. So I would say a couple years into the plan, there's no doubt about it that the city council, city staff, and community are well aware what our priorities are and how the city makes decisions. Most importantly, we focused prior to the pandemic on building accountability systems in every decision-making space throughout the organization. So conference rooms, the city council dais, staff reports, staff presentations, management meeting agendas, anywhere where we could bring the strategic plan into that space where decisions are made, we did that. And we did that through visual cues. So, you know, if you imagine going into a conference room prior to the pandemic, you know, there was constant visual cues about what our strategic plan is, workflow processes. So as, you know, proposals or spending proposals or new ideas sort of make their way up the chain, there were built-in accountability measures for us to think about how do they align with the strategic plan. And then, as I mentioned, just regular communication and road shows that we conducted to make sure that all, you know, stakeholders, all audiences in the city understood what our priorities are. I'll go ahead and next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about the importance of building alignment. As Casey mentioned about receiving the news about the ARPA funds and how that sort of led to a flurry of wants and needs and desires from all different groups. And so it was really important for us in the city to pause, block out the noise, and start to understand how we could align our process with ARPA, our decision-making process, with whatever was going on around us. So we knew that we were in the middle of a budget process, and similar to Casey, we already had our draft budget in place, and we already had our calendar, and so we really looked at the budgeting process and leveraged it and tried to find ways to start planting the seeds with City Council. Similar to Casey, those early discussions where we could pull the council in, maybe in one-on-ones, and educate them and set expectations about ARPA and its limitations and its uses. We did that certainly, and surely all the way through the budgeting process, leveraging each budget meeting to, again, plant a seed about ARPA, get policy direction where we could if we felt that we were prepared for that, and ultimately get the council to give us, adopt a resolution that helped frame the use of ARPA in Union City, and I'll talk about that in a second. The other is priority setting. So that's another thing we understood in the next couple of months. We have a priority setting process. It's really just a retreat. We do it every August. And, you know, since the strategic plan had been adopted in 2019, the city has seen a lot of significant changes, not just due to the pandemic, but we've had other things occur. The city was the victim of a cyber attack that caused, you know, the city to have to go through a significant amount of recovery and rebuilding for our IT infrastructure. Also reimagining policing, unlike Casey. Our city really proactively engaged in that space. And so, yes, our council is very supportive of police, but there was a desire to also, you know, take a look at the police service model and see how we could reimagine it to better serve our community. So a lot had happened since the initial plan was adopted. So we have this sort of confluence of ARPA and the budget process happening. And then we knew we had our retreat coming up. So again, it was just all about how do we connect these pieces, and we decided to start our priorities setting process a little early. We started sort of digging into, you know, priorities with the council to understand, you know, how our strategic priorities had changed over the last couple of years, what was important to them moving forward, especially since we had dealt with a lot of significant changes. Out of that process, really what we have started to find is that there's a few things. One is getting back to the nuts and bolts, getting back to doing nuts and bolts well. We, like others, had suffered significant revenue loss and staffing freezes and losses along the way. And so there was an overwhelming interest to get back to nuts and bolts of the city. Also engage in public works projects that have really been pushed to the side due to staffing shortages along the way. Also cyber security, that was one of the approved uses. And certainly since we had our fair share of challenges dealing with that. That was something that was easily wrapped into our priority process. And then, as I mentioned earlier, reimagining policing, we really had a comprehensive community conversation over the last 12 months. There were numerous strategies adopted on reimagining policing. And so we wanted to really be able to wrap that into our priority setting process. So for us, really in a nutshell, it was very quickly clear what the council's vision was, and we could use those priorities to help shape the ARPA process. And then lastly, community education and engagement. Really the way I look at this is sort of sprinkled from start to finish. And Casey brings up a good point of, you don't necessarily need to act immediately, but what you do need to do is communicate immediately. And one of the strategies we used early on is the minute, I would think it was maybe a day after the legislation had passed, we put out a citywide communication to the public and to employees that really set expectations on how the city was going to make a decision regarding ARPA. And, I think because we did that early on, we didn't really get too much pushback. It's once we were able to communicate right away, it seemed that most people got on board with understanding there's a process, there's a way in which Union City makes their decisions, and it's going to be about their strategic plan. Next slide. So this is just kind of a little bit to reinforce what I just went over, but a couple things in terms of building consensus on the city council regarding the use of ARPA funds, and kind of talking specifically about the decision-making model. And Steve will get into a little bit on his steps, which we'll talk a little bit about decision-making. But something that guided us was the strategic plan and our budget principles. One of the things that we leveraged was we were already in the middle of a budget process. We opened up our budget process with the council reviewing and updating their budget principles, which, at the time had not been looked at for a few years. So we really opened our budget process up with a commitment to make fiscally responsible decisions. And of course, having our strategic plan in partnership with those really helped our council go through this ARPA process, understanding what was going to guide their decision-making. I mentioned earlier, keeping both of those at the forefront of every conversation. I kid you not, every council presentation, every time the city manager had, a conversation with the council one-on-one or even just at a council meeting, every, conversation is really opened up about our strategic plan and our budget principles. So it's not an afterthought. It's something we intentionally raise in the beginning of every conversation so that the council can constantly keep their eyes focused on it. And then lastly, I mentioned this earlier, persistent communication. This was really important to managing all of those external demands. We really did not get too much peer pressure from some of the outside groups. And I think that was because from start to finish, even as sort of the news developed as it did over the last few months, we were consistently informing city staff, the city council, and community about those changes, about our process, and about our strategic plan. And we were consistent in that messaging among all three groups. And I think that helped to build transparency and trust. Ultimately, I think the win for Union City is that we were able to, along with our budget that was adopted on June 8th, we were able to, the council adopted a resolution that framed the use of ARPA around our strategic priorities. The benefit being that we still have a lot of wiggle room. So it was a pretty, we were able to really communicate the need in public safety and cybersecurity and in public works projects. But thankfully they agreed to keep it flexible, knowing that, the city has a lot of accountability measures in place to keep us spending the money based on our strategic priorities. So with that, Steve, I know I had a little bit of time there, but I hope I didn't cut you off entirely.
Nope, you're fine. Thanks. Just quickly, I want to just mention a couple of other examples, and then kind of a path forward for all of you and how you want to address your plan. City of Stockton just approved a use plan for their nearly $79 million. See, I almost gave you an extra 20 million, Stockton. 79 million in ARPA funds, about 32.5 or 40% of that is going directly back into the community for first-time home buyer assistance programs, first and last month rent assistance, community well-being initiatives, dealing with the concept of addressing food insecurities, supporting small businesses, addressing the digital divide. So in their case, they made sure that they were externally focused as well as internally focused in terms of their use. We're also assisting the county of Clark County, Nevada, which is where Las Vegas is, right? They're trying to figure out how to use their $440 million in ARPA funds. They serve a population that's actually in their unincorporated areas that's larger than Las Vegas itself. And so we're conducting a variety of different focus group workshops, interviews, online surveys, town hall type meetings throughout their unincorporated area to really hear from stakeholders and analyze, based on the county's current portfolio of services, how do we leverage that $440 million to really address the issues of homelessness and mental health and other social service needs that they have, as well as their deteriorating facility initiatives. And so with that, how do you develop your plan? In our case, it's really 5 things that we think that you should do is firstly is engage your community. And that can be done in a whole variety of different ways. And for a city like Scotts Valley, it might be a little bit more focused on the council, especially with the communication and the relationship that they have in the community. But whereas you have something larger like Clark County as my example, you might need to be a little bit more formal in terms of how that engagement is. But there's a variety of different options that you have for engaging the community, whether it's surveys or focus groups or interviews and other techniques. Leverage that, do that, and identify really where is the community aching, where is the need, and is there an opportunity for perhaps to use some of these funds to help assist them. You also need to do your lost revenue calculation, because you need to understand, okay, if we're going to look at it using this in terms of providing government services or funding, infrastructure that might be outside of the 3 buckets of water, wastewater, and broadband, you need to understand what that is. And so there's, technical calculations that need to be done carefully. We have a tool that we've created. If you're interested in that, you can go ahead and send me an email. I'm happy to provide that to you. But CSMFO, the Finance Officers Group, as well as GFOA have all created loss calculators as well. The third area, facilitate decision making. You need to facilitate study sessions or workshops with your governing board and staff to consider community needs, deliberate and narrow the options. Some agencies, you might consider bringing in some of your commissions or resident advisory committees to participate in that conversation. But you need to ultimately facilitate the conversation with the council to develop consensus in terms of the right spending plan for the use of ARPA, with the thoughtful analysis that you have done as staff in identifying where are the uses that can be used and where are there areas where it's really not cogent within the legislation. 2 other areas, and once you prepare your ARPA plan, get community input and deliberations by the governing body, you can synthesize that into an actionable plan and make sure that it corresponds with your strategic plan, that you've created milestones and that you've identified who's assigned to what, who's going to get it done, and what are the deadlines to get it done. Because remember, the clock is ticking with respect to spending these monies by December 2024. And then finally, and Casey alluded to this, you've got to set up a plan for tracking and reporting your spending. And so make sure you're setting up your books correctly, make sure you set up your information systems correctly to be able to use counting codes and document management tags, whatever it takes to help facilitate and streamline the data assembly for the report. So a lot to cover, I know. ARPA is a huge topic. You can spend hours and days going over this, but we wanted to just share the best of our perspectives with you in terms of how to create an ARPA plan for your community. The information that you have here is on your screen in terms of contact information for us. We'll also have this on the MMANC website, and I'm going to turn it back over to Felicia. Thanks.
Hi, great job, and lots of great information. And like Steve said, we could probably spend all summer talking about ARPA and all of its nuances and the guidelines, the reporting requirements and documentation that just came out. So hopefully this was a good start for you all. As Steve mentioned, we're going to have this presentation recording available on the website, as well as the slides. We also have some links posted so you can access some articles and information related to ARPA. So we'll go ahead and follow up with an email to the folks on this call, just so we can get you the resources we mentioned today and connect you to other information resources. And if you have feedback for us or other presentations you'd like to see, then we'd like to hear that as well. But thank you so much for joining us for this webinar series, and we hope to see you on the next one.